back to consider this. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. Now, the government says it has set up a special committee to speed up efforts to decriminalise drug use. To help us better understand this issue, we have joining us on Skype Professor Dr. B. Vicknasingam, Director of the Centre for Drug Research at Universiti Malaysia. Thank you so much for joining us, Prof. Vickna. Now, my first question is, I understand that decriminalising drug use should not be mistaken for legalising drugs, but I'd like you to help us understand what decriminalising drug use actually means in a broad view.
All right, thank you. I think when we talk, I think it's very important at the onset to make the distinction or be very clear that when we talk about decriminalisation, we're not talking about legalisation. Decriminalisation basically removes the criminal penalty for someone or for an individual who's using drugs or who's in small possession or small amounts or possessing small amounts of drugs. And we replace that with probably civil sanctions. Compared to legalizing drugs, that's different.
Well, Professor, if you could explain to us also the distinction between somebody who uses drugs and somebody who is addicted to drug use, and with all the all the attendant problems that come from addiction, including social problems and domestic problems and such. How does decriminalisation and the processes we hope are put in place to deal with this as a medical social issue will make that distinction?
I think this is where the problem lies in the country. I think we do not make that difference very clearly, and this is, as a result, we find that we are putting away or putting in prison people who use drugs, and it's very clear that not all people who use drugs will get dependent or will get addicted, and so I think this difference needs to be made. I think a lot of the laws in Malaysia with regard to drug users or drug dependents are very old laws. Drug dependence 1952 or Drug Dangerous Act 1952. They're very old drugs, and these were laws that were formulated during the opium epidemic and followed by the heroin epidemic. Now we have the amphetamine or methamphetamine are the largest drugs being consumed or used in the country. So these laws have not been changed, and you find that people, we don't make that very clear distinction between use, dependence, and someone who probably needs more treatment. So this is where we like to suggest that I think decriminalizing drug use, where we need to see if someone who's just using it and what are the sanctions that we need to provide, and then someone who's probably dependent, we are advocating a health-based approach rather than a criminal justice approach, which has proven to be not very successful or not successful at all. Over the last 30 years, we've been doing the same thing. So what we're advocating is decriminalization and moving towards a health-based approach from a punitive approach. This is where we're going.
But to get a sense of the problem at the moment, what do we understand about the prevalence of drug use in Malaysia? I mean, do we have stats on age, gender, location of drug users?
We do, but these are all data that we have based on arrests made, and we do not have, like what in other countries they do, is to do a population-based survey to see the drug use patterns in the general population. That would give you a better sense of the prevalence of drug use in the general population. What we have now is just data from those who are arrested, essentially those who are arrested only. So that doesn't really give you an accurate picture of the number of drug users or the actual number of drug users in the country. I understand the government plans to do a prevalence study, but this has not been conducted yet.
Could you also explain to us what you hope to see happen in terms of public policy? Now, we have a shift in the laws. We also know that some 60% of our prison population are people who are there because of drug-related offences. Do you recommend that their status change, or that somehow these laws are also retroactive and so help remove them from prisons where apparently they're at high risk of catching either HIV or hepatitis or other kinds of diseases?
Sure, I think this is what we're advocating. I think if you look at the prison population today, we say that our prisons are overcrowded, but if you really look at the data of the prison population today, more than 60% of the prisoners today in the Malaysian prisons are drug users. We're not talking of drug traffickers here, but drug users. They are in because they were using drugs, they were in small possession of drugs, which is actually used for personal consumption. So this, we are saying instead of, and if you talk to these people, if you get a sense of who the 60% of these people in prison are, these drug users in prison, you'll understand that these people have been in on numerous occasions, 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. So what are we solving here? This cycle just continues. So what we're suggesting is, instead of putting these people in prison, we should be channeling them to drug treatment programs. And we know that drug treatment programs are effective. So let's move them or channel them towards a health or treatment program rather than putting them through the criminal justice system. And we know that we have done cost calculations to show that putting a person in prison a year costs 20,600 odd ringgit, compared to putting a drug user in a drug treatment program, which only costs 5,000 over ringgit. So
Professor, we just have a little bit of time left. I want to ask you, what pushback do you expect from society, especially since much of the campaign against drug use has had a very moralistic tone these last couple of decades? Do you think people are going to be able to accept a new way of thinking about people who do use drugs, whether for recreational purposes or because they are addicted?
I think it's a matter of educating society, educating government stakeholders, criminal justice stakeholders of the problem. I think if you remember that at the beginning of the millennium, Malaysia had a huge problem of HIV, and this was attributable to drug users. And at that time, we came up with the harm reduction program of providing needles and syringes to drug users, as well as providing methadone treatment. And society was not happy at that time. How can you give needles to drug users? But I think with a lot of advocacy programs, society began to understand that this saves lives, this prevents HIV, other infectious diseases, and this has been proven to be successful. Within a decade, we have brought down the HIV infection rate among drug users to a very minimal number. So
thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. Appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. Right now, we have also joining us on Skype, Ramli Samad, who is the president of PENGASIH. Thank you so much for joining us, Ramli. Now, what would you like to see the task force that's going to be set up consider when coming up with policy to do with decriminalising drugs? What would you like to see in this process?
I would like to see more involvement of civil society, especially from among NGO and mental health experts. Because we need to see that addiction is a chronic relapsing disease, is a disease of the brain. Thus, we need to look at it from a more human perspective. Instead of just providing punishment for them, we should be more correcting or helping them.
Ramli, can I ask you this? The question of the adequacy of our system to deal with people who do have emotional or psychological needs that have forced them to turn to drugs in order to deal with them. Do we have the people? Do we have the professional help? Do we have the infrastructure if we have these laws changed in the near future?
We might not have sufficient experts. But however, we could mobilize the community and especially NGOs to assist in this process. Not all addicts require institutionalized. Some can be rehabilitated in the community or even through self-help. This has proven to be effective in some European countries, whereby they have adopted rehabilitation which is done in the community. And even some approach like Portugal, they are doing this even at workplace.
Right. So, local studies have shown that the relapse rate to drug use following release from prison is very high. We had Prof. Vickna earlier talking about relapses of 5-6 times or more. And you mentioned that rehabilitation within the community is more successful overseas. Can you make the distinction for us why one is more successful than the other?
Okay. What they undergo or what treatment modality that receive in the prison is very important. Addicts need to undergo not only physical or biological treatment, but they need to undergo a psychosocial sort of rehabilitation. What I meant in the rehab in the community is that it depends on the severity of the addict or the individual. Not all addicts require long-term rehabilitation. People that just use for a couple of years not necessarily have to undergo a long-term rehabilitation or incarceration. So we need to define this before even amending the laws.
Ramli, finally, what do you want to do with this process? Is PENGASIH involved as a stakeholder in some of these conversations about how to change the ground situation for people with a drug problem, also for youngsters who might be, experimenting and for whom drugs are just a way of expressing this emerging adulthood?
Yeah, first and foremost, Sharaad, we view people who use drugs are sick people. They need help. And we have been treating under providing treatment and rehabilitation for the last 28 years, 30 years. We see that they can change, and they do change. And we believe that no single addict want to continue to be addict. Somehow or other, they just do not find a way out of addiction. And so far, the government has not been involving us much, which we hope so, and we are willing to give our opinions, our experience, and our expert in this area.
All right, thank you so much for speaking with us, Ramli. Now, we will be back with more on Consider This, so make sure you stay tuned to Astro AWANI.